Hi, my name is Tom, and this is my channel, Integral Views. So there is an unfolding phenomena in the UK at the moment, which is called raising the colours. And I'm sure if you're in the UK, you have heard of it. And maybe you've seen flags raised out in the community, etc. And I want to answer the question definitively, is it racist? So to do that, we need to have a look at ethnocentricity and sort of look at this phenomena of raising the colours from a few different perspectives. Hopefully get, like a definitive understanding of, or a deeper understanding of what it is. And, if nothing else, if you know someone who has a certain opinion on the topic and they have a strongly held opinion on the topic, you can send them this video and maybe it'll broaden their perspective. So that's what I intend to do, and let's get started with that. Okay, so we're going to look at raising the colours from a few different perspectives, as I said. So we're going to look at examples of ethnocentricity. Of course, understanding ethnocentricity is critical and key to understanding this phenomenon, so that will become increasingly clear why that is the case through the video. So we're going to look at examples of ethnocentricity. We're going to look at ethnocentricity from a developmental psychology perspective, then from a perspective of integral theory, and then give examples of holistic forms of ethnocentricity, and then pathological forms of ethnocentricity. And finally, we will be able to definitively answer the question, is it racist? Okay, raising the colours. So this is basically an emergent phenomena in the UK where citizens are raising flags across the country. So it can be the St. George's flag or the Union Jack, and they're raising them on lampposts, on gates, on trees, basically anywhere that will hold a flag. So also they're painting them on roundabouts, on pedestrian crossings, and even our esteemed MPs are getting involved. So you can see an example here with Robert Jenrick raising a Union Jack on a lamppost. So this is what we mean, and actually it's very widespread. You drive around the UK and you're going to see St. George's crosses and or Union Jacks raised basically across the country as if it is the World Cup when it's not. Surreal. So this is an emergent phenomena. I've even seen sheep with red crosses painted on them, assuming they didn't paint them themselves. But there we go. So yeah, even the sheep are getting involved in this movement. Okay, so now we're going to look at examples of ethnocentricity. Okay, so ethnocentricity, why is it important? What are some examples of it? I mean, in its most simple form, and you hear it, said a lot, ethnocentric and ethnocentricity. What is it we mean by that? So in its most simple form, really, this is kind of like a group identity, right? So it's a sense of community that comes along with sort of some rules and, right, so you've got nation state, ethnocentricity, etc. So this is really like in-group or out-group. So when you view the world from an ethnocentric perspective, there is your community, your in-group, and then there is everybody else who are not in your in-group, the out-group, right? So actually through development of ethnocentricity within human developmental psychology and within integral theory, what happened when ethnocentricity, when that comes online, there is basically with it, like a set standard of rules of behavior. So like a rules-based order. So if you think about the next example, it's a religious doctrine, right? So within religion, you have this sense of collective. We are Christians, or we are Muslims, or we are Hindus, or Sikhs, or whoever, right? Those religions have that set guideline of expected behavior, or what is seen as commandments, or things that they deem as a community are good, or sins, things that they see as bad, and they differ to some extent across the different religions. But it isn't just religions, right? So that's just an example. So a rules-based order would apply within a nation, and that may be an ethnocentric grouping, right? So along with this sense of community comes the need for basically standards of behavior, right? So this next example, so your standards of social behavior that come with rules within this communal grouping, okay? And basically, it's a social identity. You have your sense of self, which is your individual identity, and then you move beyond that. You have a community, and that's your communal sense of identity. So some further examples, right? So sports fans, when we're basically fans of a specific sports team, that's our in-group, and then that other team that's playing against us, that's the out-group. So this is basically us exercising that sense of community, that development of ethnocentricity, which we're then expressing within sports. But there are many other expressions, right? Wars, for example. It's not always negative, but anyway, so then obviously Nazis and feudalism in general was very ethnocentric, but we'll get into that a little bit later. Other examples, tribes. So think about early human tribes. You have a tribe to protect your community and your tribe from another tribe, and that's basically within that tribe you'd have to have your rules and set standards of behavior. But another form of that would be gangs, right? So we see, sort of gangs in contemporary life, and that's just another form of ethnocentric grouping. So then also another form, so ethnocentricity is very, very prominent within adolescence, because within the stages of psychological development, ethnocentricity really is like strong within adolescence. So it develops earlier, but actually that's when it's really like powerful, right? So you've got your cliques, your in-group and out-group, and this is why teenagers are so damn difficult in school, because it is so you're in or you're out, right? Okay, and then by the way, so ethnocentricity is like the majority worldview at the moment. So from an integral perspective, we break the world down into various different stages of development and views of the world or views of reality. Ethnocentricity is the dominant view of the world. So if you take everybody in the world and you look at their center of gravity, ethnocentric will be the dominant grouping of people in the world. So it is the dominant worldview. All right, so next we're going to just look at a bit of a complicated chart that shows some different stages of development from some different perspectives. So I'm going to disappear for a while because the chart's so complicated, but we'll go through it quick and then I'll be back in a bit. All right, so this chart does look a bit overwhelming, but basically what it is just a series of different developmental models from developmental psychologists, philosophers, many different individuals that have developed their own version of developmental stages in human beings. So we have on the left we have Maslow and Gebser, and then even people like Piaget and Aurobindo, and then Graves, spirodynamics, and then Keegan and Loevinger, etc. Okay, so what this chart does is it aligns all of those different stages of development so that they're basically aligned with each other, right? So if you look on the right, you've got pre-egoic and then egoic, ethnocentric, world-centric, integral and post-integral. For this video, we're really focusing on ethnocentric. And to understand ethnocentricity, we can then look at what's meant, the definitions of each of those different stages of development within these different systems that are in this chart. And we'll do that next. But essentially, if you just look at the sequence on the right, you have pre-egoic. So just imagine a baby that is yet to form a solid sense of self. And then they form that sense of self, and that is then an egoic stage, and then they're there and they have a sense of self-reflection as an individual. And then that sense of self expands out into the community. They're aware that other people exist, and then you form bonds and community within groupings, right? So that's what's meant by ethnocentricity. It's essentially community, right? And then you move beyond that out into world centricity, but we won't focus hugely on that in this video, but it is incredibly important because it's the leading edge in the UK, and it's in the power structures and institutions. So we will get into that a little bit, but not hugely in this video. So next, what we're going to do, we're just going to look at some definitions of ethnocentricity from a couple of these different models, and then we'll really get a good sense of what we mean when we say that word. All right, I'm back. So now we're going to look at ethnocentricity from the perspective of Jane Loevinger. So Jane Loevinger is a developmental psychologist, and she developed basically a series of, like a model of human development, right, stages of human development. I recommend you go and look at her work. Just have a look at, the stages of development. Jane Loevinger. And the grouping, so the stage that Jane Loevinger refers to as ethnocentric, or ethnocentric grouping within Jane Loevinger's model, is called conformist, E4. So I've selected some text here. We're just going to read through it and then get an understanding of ethnocentricity from Jane Loevinger's perspective. So there is a right way and a wrong way, and it's the same for everyone. So as I referred to previously, basically with it, ethnocentricity and this development into a sense of community, with that comes, like a rules-based order. So a guideline of expected behavior, what defines good behavior and what defines not good behavior. Think about it from a religious perspective. You've got, the Ten Commandments or whatever in Christianity, and then, sinning, right? So there's a series of expected behaviors and things that are seen as bad. And that applies within that community, okay? So conformist or the ethnocentric person, from an ethnocentric point of view, invested in belonging to and obtaining the approval of groups. And this is really important. I'm going to read this in combination with the next part. So just to go over that again, invested in belonging to and obtaining the approval of groups. An ability to understand rules of the group appears. A group member's disapproval becomes a sanction. Okay, this is really important. So basically, an individual will be invested in how they're viewed by that certain community, that ethnocentric grouping. So if they feel aligned with a certain ethnocentric grouping, and that again, it could be a nation state, it could be a religious group, it could be a gang, it could be a teenage clique, right? So they from an ethnocentric point of view, a person will be invested in what that in-group thinks of them, but they won't really care very much about what out-groups think of them, because their sense of identity and value is determined by that in-group community, right? So now, right, think about this from the UK's perspective. So not only UK, could be any country. So when you have individuals who are not invested in the nation state as an ethnocentric connection or sense of community, then they won't play by the community's rules, by the country's rules. They won't care what people in the country think of them. They're not invested at all in that community. So essentially, it's irrelevant to them what that community thinks of them, because that's not their in-group. Their in-group is another group, right? And maybe by that group standards, they're doing just perfectly fine. And actually in the UK, you see a lot of these little replacement ethnocentric groupings appearing because our nation state ethnocentricity has been eroding, right? So, and now we start to see why this Raise the Colours movement is occurring. So essentially, you can be within a country, of course, and not care one bit what that about the rules of that country, and you might follow the laws just to basically not get locked up, but you're not really invested in the culture in the community, right? And when you have that, you have a low trust society. Sound familiar? Okay, so while the conformist likes and trusts other people within his own group, he may define that group narrowly and reject any or all outgroups. Okay, so basically, they're invested in their group, they like their group, so often love their group and feel a really strong connection with that group, but then really don't like other groups and don't really care what they think or what they do. Okay, so now we're going to look at it from another perspective. All right, so now we're going to look at ethnocentricity from the perspective of Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So you're probably more likely to be familiar with this because it's pretty well popularized. Essentially, this is just another model that sort of determines how people develop and their needs as they progress through life. So first one, psychological needs, then safety needs, and then third, and this is the one we're really interested in, love and belonging, right? So love and belonging, that sense of community, and that's what we mean by ethnocentricity. Within Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that's where community ethnocentricity sits. Okay, so I'm just going to read this quick. Love and belongingness reflects the human need for social connection, including friendship, family, romantic relationships. A sense of belonging and acceptance is essential for psychological well-being and can even override safety needs in some cases. Okay, so what I really want to point out here is that ethnocentric love and belonging is critical for human beings. We have to have that sense of community. It provides many different things, meaning, sort of that feeling of connectedness beyond even just yourself or your family, but even beyond, right? So it's really critical. It's actually quite a low down need. We have to do that to actualize higher levels of ourselves, our cognition and consciousness, and later stages, right? So that's ethnocentricity within Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Next, we're going to look at something that's close to my heart, which is integral theory and ethnocentricity within integral theory. All right, so a couple more charts. So basically what we've got here, right, is just a very quick view of integral theory and where, not all of integral theory, of course, but just some tasters. We don't need to go into too much detail, as much as I'd love to. But so if you look on the left, that little chart that's going up, you've got egocentric, ethnocentric, sociocentric, world-centric, etc. So you can see where ethnocentric sits there. But what I really wanted to just quickly point out here, why this is really important, is because the chart on the right, it shows that, essentially these stages of development we talk about with egocentric, ethnocentric, world-centric, they're not really stages linearly as they're expressed in the chart on the right, and often is the case just for convenience sake. Really, they're like expanding perspectives. So within integral theory, this is referred to as holons. So if you think of a particle, which is a whole particle in itself, but it's also part of a greater whole. So you've got the particle, and then you move out, and you've got the atom. And then you move out from the atom to the molecule, to the cell, to the tissue, to the organ, to the organism, and beyond, right? So these are they're like expanding perspectives that transcend and include the prior stage. So think about egocentricity. You develop your sense of self. As you grow from a baby into a child, you develop that sense of centeredness, self-reflection. I am now an individual in the world. And then that sense of self maintains when you move into a community, which is ethnocentric, the next stage, right? But the egocentricity still exists to some extent. It's still present, and so they grow on each other, right? So they're basically spheres of increasing perspective. Okay, so that is ethnocentricity from within an integral model, within integral theory. And next we're going to look at holistic forms of ethnocentricity. This is super important. It's so often sort of not really recognized, but we're going to look at positive forms of ethnocentricity next. All right, so holistic ethnocentricity. So this is super important, right? Because when people talk about ethnocentricity, they often just refer to the bad sides of ethnocentricity. Okay, so positive forms of ethnocentricity. I've just gathered some AI generated and or otherwise photos here, right? Pictures, as example. So positive forms of ethnocentricity. Parenting, right? So basically, to be a good parent, you have to care about someone beyond just yourself, right? So you have to care about your child, and then that's a community, that's a group, that's an in-group that you care about. So parenting is an important sort of form of positive ethnocentricity. Within an eroded sense of ethnocentricity, if you classify all ethnocentricity as bad, then you won't see so much parenting or so much prioritization of parenting. Again, does this sound familiar? So community, beyond just your family, right? So you think your family, but then also your community, right? Your group of friends. It can be communities online or on Reddit or wherever, right? On online platforms. So Also, rules-based order is an incredibly important holistic sort of outpouring from ethnocentricity. So basically, we had to have communities in order for us to have communal rules, because prior to that, it was everyone for themselves, and in some parts of the world, it still is everyone for themselves. But essentially, when you have ethnocentricity, you're able to develop as a community a sense of rules and a sense of standards of behaviour. This is incredibly important. If you erode ethnocentricity, then you erode rules-based order. Okay, so then protecting the tribe, and I've spoken about this a bit already, so I'll skip over it. Another version of this or thing to reflect on is it's our ethnocentricity, our sense of community, that gives meaning to all of these shared cultural celebrations, Diwali, Christmas, or Ramadan, or any other form of shared celebration. Those have meaning because we as a community give them meaning, and we do that within an ethnocentric grouping, right? And then the bigger that ethnocentric grouping is, the more meaning that event has, and that's something that's fantastic. If you don't have a strong sense of community and ethnocentric connection, this is not ethnic connection. This is not based on your immutable characteristics. This is based on a sense of community, right? A shared community. So you have Christians all over the world, you have Muslims all over the world, many different kinds, etc., right? But they all sort of have this shared reverence for certain things. And it's through that we can have these amazing, shared experiences that give us meaning, give our lives meaning. Very important. Again, we do see this kind of really being eroded across much of the world, especially in the developed world, say developed, in the Western world at the moment. And I will go into a little bit the reasons why that is, but essentially these shared celebrations are another form of ethnocentricity. Without ethnocentricity, that doesn't exist. All right, so that gives us a sense of belonging as well within our community, within our group. It's a sense of belonging. Again, within Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it's really important for people to have that. Without that, you're just adrift, right? And people will try to form that if they don't find that from the nation-state culture. Okay, so organized and high-trust society. So the high-trust society depends on a shared sense of cultural norms, standards of behavior, a connection, us as a community, a shared national community then, right? If you don't have that shared national community and sense of self at the community, ethnocentric, social level, well, then you can't have a high trust society. The only way you can then is by being authoritarian, increasingly authoritarian and punishing people, because people aren't invested in the culture, in the standards of behavior set by that culture. They're not invested, so they'll try to break them. And the only way you can stop that and deliver a high trust society, then it wouldn't even be a high trust society, we just with lower crime, would be to crack down. And we see that within authoritarianism, and we see that rising in the UK. All right, so now we're going to move to pathological forms of ethnocentricity. All right, so now pathological forms of ethnocentricity. Now, this is what most people will refer to they'll mean when they refer to ethnocentricity. I just want to make a really quick point. So a lot of people on the left of politics at the moment, they will condense all ethnocentricity down into pathological forms. It's why you'll see the term racist thrown at people who are not at all displaying pathological forms of ethnocentricity, who just may be concerned, parents, for example, and you'll see fascist said by Antifa. But what the left does is it basically says all forms of that cultural identity, that sense of shared community, are negative and they're pathological. And that is a very big mistake, because there are holistic forms and pathological forms, and they're quite easy to distinguish between the two. So pathological forms of ethnocentricity manifest as like oppression and demonization of the outgroup. So when you're basically unfairly oppressing an outgroup, so you've got your in-group and then you've got your out-group, you want to fight them and you want to basically oppress them and take charge of them, and they're just seen as terrible people and you don't care about them, This is a form of pathological ethnocentricity. Okay, so Nazis are a very clear example of that. That everybody knows. Of course, there are many forms throughout history, but that's a very obvious form. Islamism is another example of pathological ethnocentricity. So, fundamentalist, maybe extremist Islamic approaches, and the same for any religion. You have, pathological versions. So think about Christianity and the way that it was applied, through the Dark Ages and prior to that. So you have a lot of, this pathological ethnocentricity that sort of comes out as a negative expression of ethnocentricity. So then wars throughout history is another example. So just think of, the Crusades, just all wars basically, World War One, World War Two. Not all wars are ethnocentric in nature, but the majority throughout human history are. So gradually as humans we developed into communities, eventually those communities became whole nation states, and then those nation states had wars with each other because that was the sort of centre of gravity and the connection that people felt. They got to that state of nations, and then nations fought each other. So wars, pathological ethnocentricity. Another great example is racism. And this one, of course, this is key to what we're trying to answer in this very long video about just whether the raising the colours is racist. So racism is a pathological form of ethnocentricity, because if your sense of self is determined not culturally, not based on a shared belief system or shared sense of community, but really it's just like my, a very, very basic form of identity, like my immutable characteristics, the colour of my skin, or even the next one, right? Gender, so sex, biological sex, right? Or your ethnicity. These are like really base level kind of connections of my sense of identity, and then that group, and this is my group and that's that group, So, and we saw that throughout history, of course, as well, and we still see it today to thankfully a much lesser extent, right? But that's a pathological form of ethnocentricity. Again, so what the left or far left or the left, however you want to put it, the mistake that they make, really I prefer to call it like world centrism, right? So what world centricity does is it collapses down ethnocentricity into pathological forms. So it will think everything is racist, or it will think everything is fascist or whatever. So big mistake again. So ethno-nationalism is kind of what you see, and you actually kind of see this online in the UK, worryingly, increasingly, these sort of ethno-nationalist arguments, which I think we've really got to get away from. I don't think they're helpful at all. It's a pathological form of ethnocentricity. All right, so we are now finally well educated on ethnocentricity, and so we're going to answer the question, is raising the colours racist? No, I don't think it is. So I think that I'll just read through this quick. So raising the colours is a response to an eroded sense of holistic ethnocentricity in the UK that's been the result of multiculturalism and dismantled social contract. Okay, so what I mean by that is basically we've seen throughout the last few decades a gradual erosion and an amplifying erosion of ethnocentric behaviours and centre of gravity in the UK culturally, as our kind of community at the nation state level. And as a result of that, really raising the colours is a response to that kind of diminished sense of ethnocentric grouping at the national level. We see these groups appear with their flags, right? So in the UK from LGBT, or you've got the Free Palestine, or all these different groups, but essentially what's really kind of been eroded and deprioritized is this nation state sense of ethnocentricity. And really what we're seeing in Raising the Colours is like a reassertion of that form of ethnocentricity. So that kind of that culture as well. Okay. So next, racist elements exist, but are the small minority, and where they do exist, they are largely the result of an overextension of postmodern world centricity. So basically, again, it's like what happens when world centricity, or what people would refer to as the left, but really that world centric globalist kind of ideology, when that gets applied, it erodes that nation state sense of ethnocentricity, and that's more likely to result in the ethnocentricity that does exist, because it will always exist, being pathological. So that is more likely to cause pathological ethnocentricity than encouraging healthy forms of nation-state ethnocentricity, right? So basically, just as a quick aside there, ethnocentricity is a stage of psychological development. It doesn't only, it's not just something we go through and move beyond. It's something that we go through but is always there. So think about those expanding spheres: egocentric, ethnocentric, world-centric. Even when you've moved beyond egocentric, you still have a sense of self and as an individuated me, right? And then you move to ethnocentric, and even if you move beyond ethnocentric and move to world-centric, you still got that sense of community. So the really interesting thing, think about this. So that the people who are world-centric, they have their sense of community, and that's their expression of ethnocentricity. And that will coalesce, that will condense around certain iconography. It will condense around LGBT flags, or it will condense around Free Palestine flags, or, as I said, right, or any number of other sort of movements or groupings, Just Stop Oil or whatever it is. That's their community then, right? And that's a replacement of the nation-state ethnocentricity. I think all of these little groups are the result of that erosion of nation-state ethnocentricity. And as a result, I think that holistic ethnocentricity from the nation-state level, it's really important for that to come back into consciousness, and for all of the UK to have that strong sense of shared community across the whole of the UK. That is not a bad thing, that is a very good thing. And it transcends ethnicity. It transcends other things, other groupings that we can have, religions or whatever that may be, right? But it's the connection as a community at the nation state level that connects us all. Is it racist? No, it's not. But where there are those racist elements, of course they need to be called out and criticised. But it's not helpful to call all of it racist. It is just a simplification that basically makes the situation worse. Okay, so that's it. That was a pretty deep dive into ethnocentricity. I think that really did probably definitively answer that question. Is it racist? Raising the colours. So yeah, I hope you found that interesting. I'm going to do a number of other videos delving into these other sort of worldviews and how they connect into each other. Because eventually I'll build out that whole integral model, on my channel. And I'll give an integral view on various different cultural events as they occur. I hope you found that interesting. Please like the video and subscribe. Thanks for watching.